main architects of what there was of a Scottish Government strategy in the period from January to March?
Strategy for testing or strategy for overall? Overall. She was a critical part of that. She was the main conduit of clinical advice to me, but that advice was coming from different sources, and she was part of the collective Scottish Government team that was responsible for both devising and implementing the plan to respond to the pandemic. I don't think it would be accurate to say that was her sole responsibility. And while different people would interpret phrases in different ways, key architect, I'm respectfully not sure would properly describe it either.
She resigned on the 5th of April.
Yes.
When did you become aware of the circumstances which led to her resignation? On
the evening of the 4th, or the Saturday night. She resigned on the Sunday, if that's the 5th of April. Right. I struggle sometimes with the precise date. On the Saturday evening, I got a call from one of my special advisors who advised me that they had taken a call from a Sunday newspaper with the story that then emerged on that day.
Were attempts made within the Scottish Government to retain Dr Calderwood despite that report? So I will,
as I do for all aspects of the COVID response, but in particular this one, I take absolute responsibility. In the immediate moment, and remember we're in the very early stages of an unprecedented situation, I had two considerations in my mind, and I'll end by saying what I think I got wrong in this. Firstly, I immediately understood that there would be significant public anger about this, and that would have to be addressed, and that Dr Calderwood would have to very clearly apologise and be very clear that she had made a mistake, and that the rules apply to her as they did to anybody else. The other consideration was that we were at this relatively early but still very pivotal stage in the pandemic, from a period of decision-making that was very fast-paced, that we had to respond very quickly to things. We had begun to settle into, I'm talking internally in government decision-making, more of a rhythm of how we were doing things, of the advice and the decisions that would then lead to. And Dr Calderwood was a very key part of that. She was a conduit of clinical advice to me. I had high trust in her, and she was a key part of the communication effort as well. And therefore I was mindful of how disruptive it would be to suddenly, in those circumstances, lose a chief medical officer. And so I initially thought I wanted to try to achieve two things: address the public anger and make sure there was no doubt at all that she had made a very serious error, but retain what I thought was very valuable expertise and advice in government. I think as the Sunday progressed, I began to realise I couldn't achieve both of those things, and that if I continued to try to achieve the latter of those, I would seriously compromise trust in the government's message, and that the internal ways of working, that was something for the government to deal with, and I had to prioritise the confidence in public messaging. So that led on the Sunday evening to me having a conversation with Dr Calderwood that led to her resigning. I should say, and I want to say this on the record, she had already reached that conclusion herself and made no attempt then to avoid her resignation. And I think it is to her credit that she, at that point, was very clear with me that the public, the confidence in the public messaging had to take priority. And I do think perhaps stands contrast to other incidents, but I think that is to her credit. But it was a very difficult episode in what was overall an incredibly difficult period. Some correspondence over that weekend, as you described this, she eventually resigned late on the Sunday, the 5th, that tend to suggest that there was a process over that day whereby there was an evolving realisation, I think, that she would end up having to resign. Are you saying, for Ms Sturgeon, that your initial reaction was to try to keep her,
but that became impossible.
Yeah, I think I thought wrongly, as it turned out, and I quickly realised this was not possible to achieve both of those objectives, to make sure we didn't have the public confidence in our messaging undermined and keep the Chief Medical Officer in post in the midst of a pandemic. And I perhaps tried to give equal weight to those considerations, but over the course of that Sunday I realised that was not possible, and if I continued to try to achieve the latter, the outcome of that would be the undermining of confidence, and that quickly led to the situation that unfolded on the Sunday evening. But as I say, Dr Calderwood had already, I think herself, come to that same conclusion.
So ultimately, did you tell her to resign, or did you agree that she should? In
point of fact, I said earlier on the Chief Medical Officer is not a first ministerial appointment. I probably technically couldn't have made her resign, but that wasn't necessary. By the time I spoke to her on the phone on the Sunday evening, I was clear it was an inevitable outcome, and she was clear it was an inevitable outcome. So the conversation really became that is what was going to happen.
We've also seen some internal correspondence involving Professor Smith and others that tended to suggest that the way in which the resignation had been handled had undermined their position, and they felt that it had undermined the confidence that they felt was in them to be able to continue in that role. Was that something of which you were aware?
I wasn't aware of it at the time. Looking back on it and having now seen that correspondence, I suppose that is not surprising.